as we move along. I want to welcome all of you tonight to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, one of our virtual programs. We're so glad that we've developed this capability to be able to bring programs to you at your home or place of work or wherever in the world you may be right now. We also look forward to our reopening on November 9th. Hope you will join our celebration as we celebrate our newly renovated space with comfortable places to work and read and converse and celebrate being part of this community, which is the Athenaeum, which seeks to express the diversity of Philadelphia and all those who care about our history, about arts and culture and literature. And if you are new to the Athenaeum, I hope you will check us out and become a part of us. Tonight, we are really delighted to have with us two of the authors of Out in Central Pennsylvania, an important book about the history of the LGBT civil rights movement in Central Pennsylvania. We have with us tonight William Burton, who is the author of Out in Central Pennsylvania and who lives in Provincetown, Massachusetts. He has a master's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts and is currently contributor to the Provincetown Banner newspaper and the Gay and Lesbian Review magazine. And with him is co-writer Barry Loveland, who's the co-founder and chair of the LGBT Center of Central PA History Project, and retired after a 32-year career with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, to which we owe much of the funding that we get every year to support our programming. So thank you. He has a BS in Building Sciences from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and an MS in Historic Preservation from Eastern Michigan University. So Bill, when you're in town, you'll definitely want to come and look at our collections. He assisted Bill Burton in locating and researching the material for the book's content and was active in editing and helping to get it to publication. So you two really worked on this together, and I know that your presentation to us tonight is going to be a joint project. I want to remind all of you who are out there that we welcome any questions you may have. You may put them in the Q&A or chat anytime during the talk. And once Bill and Barry are done with their discussion of the book, I will moderate all of those questions. So please just keep them coming in whenever you have them. But right now, I invite you to join me in a virtual but very warm welcome to Barry Loveland and Bill Burton to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're really pleased to be here and be able to share some of the contents of this book with you and some of the stories that we've uncovered in LGBTQ history here in Central Pennsylvania. We're going to start. I'm going to share my screen here. We're going to start a PowerPoint. We want to start by talking a little bit about the history project, which was really the impetus for the book coming about. We opened the LGBT Center in Central Pennsylvania 10 years ago, and one of the things that we were looking for is programming to that would be of interest to the older members of the community here, a group called Aging with Pride as part of the center's programs. And so we organized a story circle that brought in a number of people that I knew were older from the community who knew a lot about the history of how the community developed here. And so that program was very well received and very exciting and generated a lot of interest. So we recognized the fact that a lot of these stories were going to be lost if we didn't do something to capture them in some form. And so we decided that we would start a history project and that we would make oral history a very important, essential component to that project, as well as collecting archival materials. So we developed a mission, which is to engage people to discover, document, collect, preserve, and present the history of the LGBTQ plus community in Central Pennsylvania through oral histories and material culture. And you'll see along the way here photographs from our collection of both artifacts and historical photos and documents as well. So our collection has grown rapidly over the last 10 years. More than 150 oral history interviews have been collected with transcriptions. Basically, I'd say all the transcriptions are online, and many of the oral history videos are online as well. We have more than 120 linear feet of archival documents and artifacts that we've collected. And we recognized early on that the LGBT Center really didn't have the suitable space nor the expertise really to manage that collection. So we entered into a partnership with Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, with their archives, which is serving as the repository for the collection. And they have been an excellent partner. They welcomed us with open arms, and it is really the fastest growing collection in their archives, as well as the most used collection in their archives. So we're very pleased with that. We present this history through a number of ways in Central PA and throughout the state. We have exhibits, including some standalone short-term exhibits that we've done, and we also have done 3 traveling exhibits. There's a panel of one of them there on the right in the photograph. We also have done a number of programs, lectures, films, and so forth. And we also have a lot of digital content that we've developed. COVID really accelerated that process in our minds. So we really started thinking about how do we get this information, this content out to all of our constituents and people who are interested. And so we've been developing that content in the last few years, especially. 12 digital exhibits online, guides to our collections online, oral history transcripts. And I mentioned the videos also on YouTube, and we have a YouTube channel there. We've also done a Google Maps database of history sites throughout central and eastern Pennsylvania, which we've now documented some 400 plus sites. So that's pretty exciting. We also have a Flickr album of 400 photographs of our collection, just for people to get some sense of what's there. And then recently we've started a collections digitization project where we're systematically going through and digitizing documents and historical photographs, and then photographing our three-dimensional object collection. So I'd say we have probably about a quarter to a third of our collection now fully digitized and online. So we're continuing with that process. Publications and something we're going to talk about tonight is one of the things that we wanted to do. So we developed the book out in central Pennsylvania. We're proud of the fact that it won a book award from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference in 2020 when it was published. And we also have a new publication, which is a self-guided tour of history sites in Harrisburg. And we are currently in process of working on 2 more of those tour guides, which will be for Lancaster and York. So we're excited about those options too. I want to turn it over to Bill, who's going to talk about how he got involved in the project and how he got involved in writing the book.
Okay. Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Hello, everybody. And how the book got started? Well, I moved to Philadelphia in 2016. And, I just gotten my master's degree in history, and I wanted to keep using that degree and in the study of gay and lesbian history. And so I looked around and see what organizations were actually doing LGBT history work. And I came across the History Project in central Pennsylvania, and I contacted Barry. And I went up to Harrisburg and met with Barry. And at that time, he gave me about 50 oral histories that they had collected. And I sat down and I read them all. And frankly, I was just blown away. It was the stories of harassment, discrimination, what people went through. And it was totally foreign to me because, I, like many young people when they were young, moved to a big city. I moved to Boston, and then here I was in Philadelphia. And I never encountered anything like what the people in central Pennsylvania went through. Everywhere I lived in Boston and Philly, there were gay neighborhoods, there were organizations. You could walk at your door and then you felt comfortable. The climate overall was liberal. Plus, where I was living in Boston, there were laws that protected gay and lesbians. Well, none of this was in central Pennsylvania. There were no laws to protect it. Back in the early 60s, and there were no gay neighborhoods. There were no organizations. And so it was just amazing to me how the community came together without all the advantages that big city had. And then you looked at all the books that were written about gay and lesbian history. Well, they basically centered on large urban areas like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. And the ones that focused on small rural areas were generally out of the South. And those were basically stories, coming out stories, or they dealt with race and religion and those kind of conflicts. But none of them ever talked about how a community developed. So that was what was important, that we, I felt that we document, that kind of history in a small, non-urban area and how community formed without all the advantages. But I told Barry, I said, it's going to be difficult finding a publisher. Most people want to write a book, you got to find a publisher, and it's difficult. Well, as serendipity would have it, Barry had written an article about what the History Project was doing, and one of the editors at Penn State Press had seen it. And she contacted Barry and said, we saw what you were doing, and this, we think, could make a great book. Would anybody be willing to work with, anybody on your staff be willing to work with us? And well, hello, I raised my hand. We'd love to do that. So suddenly we had a publisher in the palm of our hands and go through with this project. And so the big issue was like how to organize the book, and Penn State suggested that we do it by decades. And when we did that, I was able to sit down with Barry and say, okay, what happened in the 60s? Who were the people involved? Who should we talk about? And the same with the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s and so far, we're able to keynote what were the important organizations, how did it grow, and who were the people involved. And so that's kind of how the book came about. So the book itself, when you look at the chapters, the first chapter is, we call it Discovery, and it's really origins of the community. We start out with coming out stories. What was it like to be gay back in the 50s and 60s in central Pennsylvania? Then we looked at the early gay bars. There were only like one or two at that time. And then we looked at other things, like there was a police, there were protests going on prior to Stonewall. And there was police harassment constantly all over across the country. And central Pennsylvania was no different. Back in the 65, there was the police were raiding State Street. That was a big cruising area back then, arresting people. And they did a raid on the Clock Bar. And we also talked about the first gay activist, Richard Schlegel. He formed the first gay activist group at that time back in the 60s called the Janus. For chapter 2, we move on as after the Stonewall riots, then more awareness started to grow. And we focused in on what happened in central Pennsylvania. And there was one guy, Jerry Brennan, who, had gone to New York right after the Stonewall riots, and he was basically moved by what was going on and wanted to bring that back to central Pennsylvania. And he was also frustrated by the fact that there was like no place for gay and lesbians to meet other than the few gay bars. And he felt it was important that other social organizations and activist organizations form, that gay people could meet and find each other and help with this, help find each other and find other gay people, plus, fight for the rights. So he started two things. The first thing he formed was Dignity Central PA, which was a religious organization, and they held services. But the interesting thing is that they also had social gatherings afterwards, or different social events. And they found that the social events were gathering more people than the religious meetings and the services. And then he also formed the Gay Switchboard of Harrisburg, which enabled people to call in and find out where they could get legal help, where there was gay activities, where they could meet other people, and things that were afforded to them. Also at that time, Metropolitan Community Church congregations were forming, and not only in Harrisburg, but in Lancaster. And they too followed the model of dignity. They had church services, but then they had social events, and they found the social events were gathering more people than the religious events. So people were starting to network at that point. Then Lorraine, see a picture up there on the upper right. She was concerned about that there was only like one gay bar for women at that time. And she was frustrated too, like Jerry, about how the women meet other women. And so she started a thing called the Lavender Letter. And they actually came up with different events like a potluck or a bowling night or a movie night. And they would advertise these events in the newsletter, said like, call Jane at this number. People were screened to make sure they were on the up and up, and no last names were given. But then when they called, they were saying, okay, here's the address, here's the potluck, and women could go there and meet other women. So at the height of it, this is before the internet, at the height of the Lavender's Letter existence, they had over 500 women on this mailing list. Then David Lees and Barry Weaver were also concerned about getting the news out about what was happening in the rest of the country as far as gay and lesbian rights and activist activities. And so they started the Gay Era newspaper. And it was sold in bars and in some bookstores. And it helped spread the news to gay people about what was happening in the country regarding, being gay and gay rights. Other organizations started to form too, because of the activist movement in Reading, Allentown, Scranton, and in Williamsport. And again, the membership started to grow. They had activist activities, but they also had social events. So all this started to forming a network in the 70s. In the next chapter, we talk awakening. And this really centers on Penn State, because at that time, with the activist movement, colleges and universities across the country, they were forming gay groups and activist organizations. And at Penn State, they formed a group called Homophiles at Penn State. It was formed and chartered in 1971. But shortly after it was chartered, the administration suspended the charter because they felt it was gay and it was not a moral thing to do and didn't line up with Penn State's priorities. Well, Hops sued and they won. And so the organization was reinstated, and they then began their activities both in activist organizations, education, and in social activities. But also what happened with the Hops incidents, one of the presidents, Joe Akinfora, he was becoming a teacher and he was trying to get his teaching credentials. And because of his affiliation with Hops, the governing body at Penn State couldn't decide whether to grant him a recommendation to get his teaching certificate. So while all that was pending, because it went to the director of education in Pennsylvania, while that was pending, Joe got a job in Maryland and as a teacher. Well, by the time the director of education in Pennsylvania decided to grant Joe his teaching certificate, it made news. And so before the news broke, he went to the people that he was working for at the school district and told them this is going to happen. And obviously he was gay. And because of that, they moved him out of the classroom and into a desk job. Joe fought and tried to sue to get his teaching certificate back. He had filed a case in the Supreme Court. They wouldn't hear it. And so Joe was never able to teach again. But he did remain an activist. In the next chapter, we move on to convergence as we talk about Governor Shapp's initiatives. So Barry, why don't you take over and talk about that?
All right. So Governor Shapp was elected in the 1970s, and he was Pennsylvania's first Jewish governor, but he was also the first governor in the United States to meet with LGBTQ activists. Mark Siegel, an activist from Philadelphia, it's a name that I'm sure a lot of Philadelphians on the call here or on the Zoom are probably familiar with, as publisher of the Philadelphia Gay News. Mark wrote a letter to Governor Shapp and challenged him and asked him for a meeting. And Governor Shapp thought about that and decided that he would invite Mark to a meeting. He was on the road doing some traveling around the state, and they met in Conshohocken, I believe. And so basically, Mark pitched to Governor Shapp some ideas about ways that he felt that the governor could improve the lot of LGBTQ people in Pennsylvania. Governor Shapp listened attentively, and he even called the press in at the end of the meeting, and was not embarrassed by the fact that he was meeting with a gay activist. Governor Shapp went back and started thinking about what Mark had asked him to do, and he decided he would, as one of the things that Mark requested, was to create an advisory task force from people from the LGBTQ community from all around the state. And Governor Shapp decided he would do that. So he created this task force. He invited LGBTQ activists. He invited all the state agencies to send a representative to listen and try to determine what ways they could improve services and policies and so forth for LGBTQ people. So this task force had its first meeting in November of 1974, then also at the one of the meetings, they had recommended that Governor Shapp provide some kind of protection for job discrimination for LGBTQ people. Well, the governor didn't have the authority to do a sweeping executive order that would eliminate discrimination in all the private companies in Pennsylvania. That would take an act of the legislature, an act that we're still waiting for, by the way, all these years later. So in thinking about that, he said, well, what I can do is I can prohibit discrimination for state employees, because that's within my jurisdiction and within my power. So he was the first governor of any state to issue an executive order that protected state employees from discrimination based on sexual orientation in April of 1975. California would do it 3 years later. Then Governor Shapp decided that he would formalize the task force. It had been meeting for about a year or so. And in February of 1976, he issued another executive order, which provided for the official body called the Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities, which is the first governmental body in the United States that's been documented for improving public policy for LGBTQ plus people. Shapp then also went on to issue an executive order proclaiming Gay Pride Week. Again, the first governor of any state to issue any kind of proclamation like that. So Governor Shapp was really very much ahead of his time. We don't think about Pennsylvania being kind of at the forefront of LGBTQ civil rights, particularly since we're still waiting for that statewide law that would protect all of us. But nonetheless, Governor Shapp did what he could and made a significant contribution to improving LGBTQ public policy. The council continued to meet for about 10 years, and in its later years, it was very instrumental in creating some of the most progressive policies on HIV/AIDS of any state in the country. It was considered really a model for many of its policies and training and education. It's served its purpose quite well for many years. As a result of the meetings of the council, it brought together representatives from all over the state, and there were representatives from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but there were also a lot of representatives from the rural parts of the state, small cities, and so forth. And this group of people who had really not known each other very well because of distance and travel and everything, started to get to know each other at these meetings. And they began to caucus after the regular council meetings. And they decided that they would form an organization or a network that would be able to work with each other to achieve projects and efforts that would have been impossible with all these small independent organizations throughout the state. So in 1975, they formed this coalition called the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus. They organized the first gay conference, statewide conference in Harrisburg in the fall of 1975. They organized the first, what they called the Gay Education Day, or Lobby Day, really, for lobbying the legislature in 1976. More than 100 people showed up from all over the state to actively lobby their legislators. They organized the first gay rights demonstration in Harrisburg called Human Rights Day. And this photograph on the right shows you a scene of that. And that was really to combat some of the legislation that was being proposed that was pushing back on what Shapp had been doing. He ran into quite a bit of opposition from his Republican-controlled legislature at the time, and a number of pieces of legislation were attempting to prevent people from in certain occupations who get licensed through the state and other areas from actually getting licensed and practicing their chosen profession. Fortunately, those pieces of legislation were all either didn't make it to Shapp's desk or were vetoed by Shapp. And then the organization also created several other statewide gay conferences later in 78, 79, and 80. So remained pretty active throughout the 70s. Bill, you want to take over here?
Yeah, and the next chapter, we move on to the cases. Like I said, the first 7 cases of AIDS were reported in Pennsylvania in 1982. In late 83, 2 gentlemen, Roger Beatty and Frank Fazoli, Frank had lived in New York, and he was very much aware of the AIDS crisis as it was building. He knew there was a tsunami coming. And so both men began holding meetings about what they could do to help people that were getting AIDS and what they should do. And so they both found out they both doing the same thing. So they merged their meetings together. And then they decided to form this organization called the South Central AIDS Assistant Network, better known as SCAN, in 1986. And this is an organization that would provide meals, legal help, housing, equipment for people that were ill, that were suffering from AIDS. At the same time in Lancaster, they formed the Lancaster AIDS Project. Also, Benny, because there was a housing crisis, because people were getting kicked out of their homes or whatever because they had AIDS, she developed the house, the Betty Finney House, which would house people suffering from AIDS. By the way, the Lancaster AIDS Project and SCAN merged eventually, and that organization is still functioning today with the AIDS work. Also in York, Joy Euthema was a nurse that dealt with people that were the last, death and dying, and she knew that she wanted to do something, and so she developed a hospice in 1990 in York. Went to the mayor of York, and he gave her a house free of charge. All she had to do was pay the taxes on it, and that house, it's a picture there that was taken during the AIDS crisis at the hospice. And during the duration of the hospice, they served over 93 people that were suffering and dying from AIDS. The next chapter, we talked the battles. And this is when since there was no overall statewide law that would protect gays and lesbians, it was basically left up to the cities and towns to pass that legislation that would protect gays and lesbians in their own towns. Philadelphia was the first one in 1982 to pass such an ordinance. In 1983, Harrisburg decided that they needed to pass an ordinance, and it was passed unanimously by a bipartisan council. It did meet with opposition, as they all did. All that opposition basically was religious based, that they were endorsing the homosexual lifestyle and immoral behavior, as opposed to looking at it from a civil rights point of view. But it did pass unanimously in Harrisburg. During that, one of the people that were testifying or fighting for this protection was a woman named Jackie Schultz, and she had a gay son, and she was president of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Gay and Lesbian Youth, and she testified at the Harrisburg Council ordinance meeting at the City Council. Well, later that week, someone at her apartment building took a stack of religious tracts, put them at the door, and set them on fire. The fire was extinguished before it caused any major damage or personal injury, but the police felt it was because Jackie was in the newspaper. They had to give her address because she testified at the council. That's why they picked her house and tried to start a fire. Then in 1991, Lancaster takes on the fight to pass an ordinance. There was a couple activists, Nancy Helm and Mark Stoner, that formed a group called the Pink Triangle, and they were trying to, lobby the council in Lancaster to pass this ordinance. When word got out, the KKK suddenly appeared to protest what was going on with the Lancaster Council trying to pass this ordinance. There was no one was hurt, but there was like 4,000 people protesting this, watching the KKK march through the streets of Lancaster. Even though it was passed in 1991 to form a human rights council to protect gays and lesbians in Lancaster, the county refused to endorse it because they said you're endorsing an immoral lifestyle. We're not going to support it. And if Lancaster tried to take funds and form their own council, human relations organization to enforce this ordinance, then the county said, we'll reduce the services that we're giving to the city. So this went on for 10 years until the mayor in 2001 was able to negotiate something, and they were able to form their Human Rights Council and enforce the ordinance in the city of Lancaster. But it didn't have, the fight in Lancaster had also fallout like Jackie Schultz. Nancy Helm, who was one of the activists that was fighting for this ordinance, she certainly became well known in the city, in the town. But Nancy also had this desire to open a bookstore. For years, she had gone to Philadelphia to Giovanni's room, and she loved, perusing through the bookstore and buying books. And she wanted that same kind of thing to happen in Lancaster. So she put together money. She found a space on Prince Street, one of the main streets in Lancaster, and opened a bookstore in May. Well, by August, during that whole time, she kept getting threats because they didn't like the idea of a bookstore in Lancaster. In August, I think, of the year, that first year, at night, she got a phone call that her bookstore had been firebombed, and they had put a firebomb on the door. It didn't cause that much damage, but it did blow out a window and stuff like that. And, she recouped. She remained undaunted and reopened the bookstore. Within another month, she kept her car, every time she walked down the street, they'd say slurs against her. And she noticed that she was being followed in the car. The police wouldn't do anything about it. Then within a couple of weeks, her bookstore was firebombed again. This time it did major damage. And obviously it upset her a great deal. She was able to remodel and get the bookstore back open, but she was constantly living in fear because the threats just still kept coming. So by early spring of the following year, the threats became too much, and the police weren't finding the perpetrators who had done the bookstore bombing. She thought they didn't care about it. They weren't trying to find who did it. And she was afraid for her life and the life of her customers. And so she closed the bookstore. Within 3 weeks of closing her bookstore, the police were able to apprehend the people that caused the firebombing. And they were brought to justice. They were sent to jail, and they were finally caught. I had the pleasure or the honor of interviewing Nancy for this book. And even as she told the story, tears were coming to her eyes. It was still a painful thing to go through that she went through, 30 some odd years ago. The next town that we look at was the York area. And this was an initiative really started by the Mayor Al House. And he was actually the president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors for the United States. And every year they had their annual meeting in Colorado. And when they went to Colorado, they were all really upset about what the state of Colorado was doing, because they were passing legislation that was denying any kind of rights to gays and lesbians. That spurred the mayor into action. He made news, and he was on Nightline, Ted Koppel's Nightline, if you all remember that, talking about this thing that was happening in Colorado. And he said he was going to go back to York and work on having an ordinance added to the town to protect gays and lesbians. It met with opposition, obviously. One of the local pastor, James Grove, invited this guy, Paul Cameron, to come to York and kind of counteract what was going on. Well, Paul Cameron had all these kind of strange ideas that it was also, gays and lesbians were a threat not only to morality, but also to health and public safety. Well, during this whole course of interaction, it found out that Paul Cameron really was kind of a fake, and he was debunked. And so the mayor was able then to get the council to approve the non-discrimination ordinances for York. And Mayor Outhouse, I feel like belongs in the same category as Governor Shapp. He was a straight man fighting for the rights, an ally, and one of the first to take a stand to protect gays and lesbians, not only in the state, but in their town. The next chapter, we move on to the history of Pride. Stonewall, we all know, happened in 1969. Well, it took like 15 years or 16 years for Central Pennsylvania to have some kind of pride festival. Philadelphia reacted right away, like the next year, and they were having, pride parades in Philly. But people from Central Pennsylvania, if they wanted to celebrate pride, they were going to Philly. But some people decided it's time for Central Pennsylvania to have its own festival, its pride event, but they were afraid to call it pride. They were afraid to put any kind of gay title to it because fear of opposition. And so they call it the Open Air Festival. And when they went to the picnic grounds, I think it's ironic that they held it at the police picnic grounds. But anyway, they when they went to the grounds, the people that knew it was there, it was all lined by pink balloons. That soon, with the AIDS crisis, it morphed into a thing called the Unity Festival, where they were charging admission and raising money to help fight for the AIDS crisis. Then it eventually moved back again and with the name of Pride Festival in Central Pennsylvania. And Barry himself was involved with that to give the word pride back in to the name of the festival. And it's had ever since then, pride or gay and lesbian pride, ever since then in Harrisburg. Lancaster in the year 2007 decided to have its own festival. The first year they did it, they were almost ready to go. And the city, pulled this thing out, said, your application was too late. And so they had to delay it a year. And it finally started happening in Lancaster in 2008. Also, York started having theirs later on, the York Festival. In chapter 8, we move in finally to the 21st century. I kind of focused on 3 stories here. The first one was a Jennifer Harris story. She was a star basketball player on Penn State's women's team. And the coach at that time was Renee Portland. And she was considered the most winningest basketball coach in the country. She had won more titles for Penn State than her coach in university. But she also was very, pardon me, blatant about that she did not want any lesbians on her team. She was vocal about it. Well, after 2 years of outstanding play, Jennifer was sidelined, and she filed a suit against Renee with Penn State, claiming sexual discrimination and racial discrimination. Penn State looked into it, and suddenly Renee Portland resigned. They wouldn't say it was because of anything. They just said on her own merit, she resigned. So it took someone like Jennifer Harris to bring about some fairness at Penn State. We also move into Trans Central PA and the rise of transgender activists. Janine Rusham was the founder of Trans Central PA. She's there at the lower picture at the podium. And they were quite active in providing health and services to transgendered people within the state. And they formed a thing called the Keystone Conference, which was a big conference for transgender people that would talk about surgeries and relationships and all things that they will have to deal with as being a transgender person. And that conference today gathers about 800 people a year. Then we talk about how in Harrisburg, the LGBT Center formed in Harrisburg, and that whole story. So that's really kind of the book. Barry, you want to?
Yeah, just to wrap up, the book has been an incredible gift, really, for our community. I think here in Central Pennsylvania, having these stories documented and getting these stories out to the community. We just keep getting more and more feedback all the time from our local community here in Central PA that's been that they really enjoy the book and enjoy having this history project, making this history possible to hear. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Bill and Barry. And for our attendees, please put any questions in the chat or the Q&A. I want to thank you. I know before I was at the Athenaeum, I was executive director of the Presbyterian Historical Society, which was the first national denominational archives to intentionally collect the history and archival materials of the LGBTQ Presbyterians. Or people there, you know, and I knew from personal testimony how meaningful that was for individuals to say my story matters and I'm being heard. So I appreciate this tremendous project that you all have undertaken and the book that has come out of it. As we're waiting for questions, one, I'm amazed. I'm also from California, so I've always kind of assumed that California was leading the path. But to hear that Pennsylvania led the path in the 70s, I think is just really wonderful to hear. I'm curious. I know, Bill, you spoke about, you know, having been in cities as a young adult, you had a very different experience than you heard as you engaged in this project. And I'm wondering, what sort of interaction was there between Philadelphia and Central PA in this time? And also, was there pushback? Was, you know, were some of the activists in more rural parts of Pennsylvania pushing back against activists in Philadelphia and saying, hey, our issues are different, or don't make assumptions, or, you know, what was happening?
During that time that I was writing the book, you mean?
Yeah,
No,
during the time that was done in the book. So the period that you covered, as you heard this, as you learned the stories.
No, there was no really pushback between Philadelphia and Central PA. It was like the people in Central PA were kind of like having to go to Philly if they want to participate in any kind of protest or whatever. And I think that they basically work well together, just understanding each organization in Philly or Central Pennsylvania, what each other needed. The thing that I was just amazed that, you know, the thing that, like in the Rural Gay Caucus, when they first formed it, it was basically the members were kind of a majority were from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and the people from the rural areas kind of protested against that because, you know, there's more than just Pittsburgh and Philly with what was going on, and that's when they changed the balance of power, and they were able to add more members to the council. Rural members to kind of balance out, you know, the weight between, you know, Philly and Pittsburgh and Central Pennsylvania, made it more equitable.
Yeah, I just add to that actually the people from Central PA were gaining a lot of support from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh activists, especially Philadelphia, I think. People like Mark Siegel were just wonderful because you know, some of the activists from small towns in Central PA, like Williamsport and places like that, would some help here trying to figure out how to do, you know, and get an organization started up here. And so Mark would travel all over the state, and other activists would travel all over the state to these small cities, serving as kind of consultants, you know, sharing their experience, sharing their thoughts about how to organize. And so, yeah, they really supported each other. And I know Hops was the same situation. They invited lectures from Barbara Giddings, from people in the Janus Society, from people in Mattachine, all the way through to you know, later organizations as well, to speak on campus, and they were really helpful to the community here.
Thank you. I mean, that is the surprising answer for me, and so that's really nice to hear that there was a collaboration
And so Al has a question, and they want to know what was the most surprising thing you uncovered in researching this book. And that means each of you can answer that question.
Well, for me, it was Governor Shapp. I wasn't expecting that when we started doing the research. And it just amazed me that that the first thing that happened anywhere in the country happened here due to Governor Shapp. And to me, it's like he remains this unsung hero that is not given enough credit even today for what the groundbreaking thing that he did. Because like prior to him, there wasn't one governor in the country that would meet with the gay activists. And it took him great courage to meet with Mark and have it photographed and have it in the Philadelphia Inquirer and everywhere else. I think that took enormous courage. You see how people run from controversial stuff today or backpedal. He was right out there up front. And the same with Mayor Outhouse. Those were, I think, incredible feats of courage that put their politics aside and did what was right. So.
How about you, Barry?
Yeah, and I would say, in addition to that, that was a very surprising thing for me as well. I think the other thing that surprised me most was that the persistence of some of the activists that we found and interviewed over the course of just decades. For example, we interviewed one activist in Williamsport, Dan Manival, who had, when he was in his early 20s, he was protesting Anita Bryant at a appearance that she made at the Bloomsburg Fair. Anita Bryant was this, anti-gay icon basically in the 70s and 80s. But he was brave, and he decided to appear and speak at this rally, this anti-Anita Bryant rally in Williamsport. This is a town which had like one gay bar and very little in terms of what you could consider any kind of activism. And he appeared on the local news. And so this was someone who was just starting his career and living in this place that didn't have a lot of support for him. And as a result of that, there were a number of people in his neighborhood who saw the newscast, and they didn't like that. And they didn't like the fact that there was a gay person living among them. So they started attacking his house, and they threw bricks and they threw rocks, and they broke out every window. They broke out doors to the point where he was afraid. He sold his house. This was his family home that his parents had built, and he inherited. His parents died when he was in his 20s. And yet all of this happened to him. And to this day, he is actively involved in organizations in Williamsport, working for LGBTQ rights. He was one of the organizers of the first Pride Festival up there that was held this year, all these years later. And it's just amazing to me that people can get over all the discrimination and problems that they faced, and still persist and do this work. It's been amazing, very inspirational.
But also, I'd like to add another thing that, like I said, I lived in Boston for the majority of my life, and I never dealt. I had a built-in safety net, because I lived in a gay neighborhood. There were organizations, there were state laws to protect me. And then when I started researching this book and looking what these people went through, that they stayed there and how the community eventually formed and developed, and it is what it is today. they paved the way for the people that are living there now to have a comfortable life. And, I feel like they're giants in what they're able to do and how that community formed together without all those advantages that I had when I was young and living, the early years of life. I said I lived in a bubble. I had no idea. It was all very safe. It's like when the bookstore was bombed, I said at that time I was in Boston, there were 3 gay bookstores. 3 gay bookstores. There was no bombing. Nobody cared. I was just amazed by that. So
Yeah, it really is interesting as think about it's not only the right to openly love who you want to love and work where you want to work, but just those First Amendment rights that they had to fight for to gather for social purposes, to worship freely, and to have freedom of the press, and that they had to, they were fighting for that, and we're still fighting for those rights today. So that is really powerful. Angel wonders what you think is the most important thing, and we had this question, then one more in the chat. Gwendolyn, we'll get to yours next. What do you think is the most important thing people should understand about the Central PA LGBTQ plus history based on your work for this project? This is multi-pronged. What ways do you think current activists can use the knowledge of the history to help us succeed in the battles today in Pennsylvania?
Well, I would say Barry can answer too. I would say it takes courage and stamina. If you look at what happened in central Pennsylvania, in these towns, it's a lesson that it can still be repeated today. And it takes people of courage to stand up and do that and say, I'm going to fight for this. So it takes a lot of guts to do that. Barry?
Yeah, I think so. And, this community managed to organize itself and pull together to fight a lot of different battles throughout its history. And so it's really, it's even though there were obstacles in terms of geography, in terms of trying to come together as groups, people would get in their car and drive an hour to attend a meeting, to attend a protest march, to do whatever, because they were invested in the outcome. And so I think the persistence, the dedication that people have made to the cause has been very strong here. As a result, we have an LGBT center in Harrisburg. We have one that started recently in Lancaster and one in York now. So the infrastructure of this community has been building slowly over time, and we've really accomplished a tremendous amount here. And as far as I forgot the second part of the question now, I'm sorry. What can you learn from that? Is that it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, well, I think what we can learn today is that, it does take a lot of work and a lot of persistence. But we built incrementally on the progress that is made, year by year. And you can't expect everything to happen overnight. It's going to take time, but persistence and hard work certainly will make progress.
I think that ties right into our last question from Gwendolyn, who comes from south of Pittsburgh. You say this network is growing. Gwendolyn wonders if there are any opportunities for people to get involved as volunteers with your organization if they are located outside of Central PA.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I love getting projects started in other places. One of the things that we did in recent years, about maybe 5 years ago, is we started working with the Lehigh Valley Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Center I provided some training for them on oral history, and they started doing oral history work, and they also started collecting materials in partnership with a local college there in Allentown. So I always am eager to talk to groups that are interested in starting their own history projects in other parts of the state. So I'd be very happy to do that. If you want to just drop me an email at history@centralpa.lgbtcenter.org.
And Tess will send out, when we send out the link for this,
happy to talk
Tess
about
can
that.
send out that email address also if anybody wants to
Great.
connect. As you see in the chat, you're getting lots of accolades from everybody for a fantastic talk. It was really informative and helpful, and I think uplifting to know that there are people doing this work. So thank you, and thank you on behalf of everybody who attended that, and encourage people when we put this up on our website to watch if they weren't able to attend tonight. Barry and Bill, I hope you, when you find your way to Philadelphia, will visit us at the Athenaeum. We'd love to host you there.
Okay.
And
Great.
enjoy coffee with you and more conversation. I'm sure many of the folks who attended tonight, if they are in the Philadelphia area, would love to have a conversation in person with you as well. So thank you so much for attending. We look forward to seeing all of you soon. You can go to our events page and learn more about the events that we have coming up at the Athenaeum, both currently virtual, but also starting in November in person when we reopen. And wishing you all a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great.
Bye-bye.